Progressive overload. We know it's one of the primary scientific principles for developing strength, or any fitness aspect for that matter. But my problem is that it's one of the most misunderstood aspects of programming, and unknowingly, one of the reasons why people hit a plateau and end up seeing no progress. In this video, I'm going to revisit what we thought was a simple principle, go through the misconceptions that you may not realize that you're actually holding, and break down the full truth about progressive overload. Now, if we do a simple Google search, here are some definitions that you may find. Now, some of these definitions are dumbed down to the point that they are a bit off in my opinion, but they're close enough to communicate the idea that the nature of training becomes gradually more demanding through time in order for progress to happen. So this observed progression can occur in various combinations of training variables being manipulated. So training variables can include exercise selection, volume, and intensity. But what is this principle for training predicated on? It's predicated on the idea that the human body responds to the stresses that are imposed on it by its environment. Now, in the context of building muscle and strength, it's important to remember that holding onto muscle is calorie consuming. Now, as an organism that is designed to survive, burning more calories isn't necessarily going to be conducive to survival. So your body will not maintain muscle if it doesn't need to. So subjecting your body into a lifestyle of lifting will provide your body with the overload that will trigger it to adapt. Now, creating adaptations basically means creating physiological and anatomical changes within your body. Now, over time, the body becomes resistant to the stresses of exercise at a given level. Now, this resistance results from the adaptations the body has made in response to the previous exercise stimuli. This is adaptive resistance. So, for continual development in muscle and strength, there needs to be a progressive overloading in the stimuli. But what does progressive overload look like in research? Now, if we look at this paper by Mark Peterson and colleagues titled Applications of the Dose Response for Muscular Strength Development, a review of meta-analytic efficacy and reliability for designing training prescription, we get these two really nice graphs depicting the gains that different populations get from being exposed to various levels of volume and intensity. As you can see, when comparing untrained individuals to athlete populations, the average level of volumes and intensity that is needed to get you stronger increases. In addition to that, you can also see that the size of the progress that you get over time reduces as well. But you often hear terms like progress, progression, along with progressive overload. Now, are they the same thing? And the answer is no. And in my experience, I think this is where most people misunderstand these terms and subsequently misunderstand progressive overload. Now, if we understand these terms, it can help us use progressive overload properly in our programming. So the way I define progress and progression are going to be different. Progress refers to the occurrence in increase in performance, whereas progression refers to the increase in training stimulus or stress. So let's take a look at some examples. Let's say we've got week 1, week 2, and week 3. So week 1, we've got 1 set of 5 at RP6, and let's say you end up hitting that prescription for 100 kilos. Week 2, 1 set of 5 at RP6 again, and you ended up hitting 105 kilos. Week 3, you hit 1 set of 5 at RP6 again, and then you hit 110 kilos. So you can see that the prescription is the same, but there is no progression. But there has been progress. So the prescription of 1/5 at RP6 is sufficient enough to create overload that is sufficient for you to be able to recover from and create new gains the week after. Now, let's look at another example. So let's say you got week 1, week 2, and week 3. So week 1, you got 1 set of 5 at RP6, you end up hitting 100 kilos. Let's say the estimated 1 rep max was equivalent to 130 kilos. Week 2, you got 1 set of 5 at RP7, you ended up hitting 110 kilos, which means an estimated 1 rep max of about 140 kilos. And let's say, well, for week 3, you got 1 set of 5 at RP8 and you ended up hitting 120 kilos, which means an estimated 1 rep max of, let's say, about 147.5 kilos. So you can see in this example that the prescription contains an RP intensity progression. And if we work out the estimated 1 rep max, there has been progress. So the prescription of the training across 3 weeks contains progressive overload. Now let's look at this one final example, assuming that it's a percentage-based prescription. Let's say week 1, you did 1 set of 5 and you ended up hitting 100 kilos at RP6, which results in an estimated 1 rep max of about 130 kilos. Week 2, you hit 1 set of 5 at 102.5 kilos, and that was RP7, and that also equates to the same sort of estimated 1 rep max. And week 3, you hit 105 for the same prescription, same number of reps, RP8, which also works out to be about 130 kilos as an estimated 1 rep max. As you can see, there is progression in the load and the RP intensity. But if we were to analyze the top end strength equivalent or the estimated 1 rep max, you can see that it isn't obvious that there's actually been any progress. Now, we could say that there is insufficient overload, but it could also be that there may be too much for you to be able to recover from. And so there hasn't been immediate progress. Now, if there is too much overload, there may be an absence of fatigue management. And if there was a deload, supercompensation may actually occur when fatigue dissipates. This is also assuming perfect conditions for training and recovery. Now, these are just very simplified and isolated examples to see how the concept of progress, progression, and overload can be used to describe a situation. So if you understand this about progress, progression, and progressive overload, you can see why the concept of RP prescription is incredibly useful in powerlifting. So if you want to find out more about RP training and whether low RP work is useless, check out this video here. Now, back to topic. Now, the thing that I want you to take away from this is that training sessions, microcycles, or even mesocycles do not necessarily need to have progressions between each other, i.e. between microcycles or mesocycles, in order for overload and progress to happen. As multiple runs of the same session, microcycles or mesocycles can still be sufficient for overload to occur for weeks and months at a time. This is why a lot of lifters may find that a program or training block can work for several runs at a time until it doesn't. It's also worth noting the progress achieved after every run of the program, so you can see when the progress starts to slow down. Now, before I discuss common mistakes that most people make, about 15% of you that watch this channel are subscribed. Now, if we try to get that percentage up, and if I reach 1,000 subscribers, I will release a free intermediate powerlifting training program for you guys to use. So hit the subscribe button. So now let's talk about some myths, misconceptions, and mistakes of progressive overload. So the first misconception is that if there is regression in training difficulty, muscle and strength will be lost. Now, this obviously can be true at extremities, but obviously not always true. Remember that training dose can be viewed as a bell curve. And actually, if we take volume and intensity into consideration, it's more like a 3D bell curve. If you are hypothetically at the peak, where you are at the most optimal level of intensity and volume, doing slightly less can still elicit progress, albeit less. Now, if you were to shift down the scale even more, you'd reach towards a maintenance dose of a combination of volume and intensity. And this would be the dose where you would actually maintain your strength without losing or gaining. So the second myth is that volume or absolute intensity has to increase week after week. Nope, not true. This is a common mistake with people newer to powerlifting programming. Now, there seems to be a misunderstanding with the amplitude of change in volume and intensity with the time frame this normally happens. Short to medium term, meaning across months or even a couple of years, the profile of intensity and volume needed for progressive overload to happen doesn't actually deviate all that much. This is why when you look at really advanced athletes, they're not actually performing 1 million sets a week or even perform loads of really high intensity sets, even after a decade of competitive powerlifting. Now, you may want to reduce volume and intensity when you're deloading or when you're starting a new block and want to titrate the dose upwards, but the deviations between weeks or even blocks of training doesn't change that much. Now, the third and final mistake is the idea that you have to manually proactively program the progressive overload. Now, this is a common mistake that I see with newer coaches, where coaches will write down an increase in load or volume because the stimuli needs to increase. From a practical standpoint, for newer lifters, you may be able to get away with it as newer lifters can make fast progress. However, with enough experience, you'll realize that what you need to do is to allow the overload and progress to happen organically. And what I mean by that is that the training at the dose where the lifter can get stronger is the new strength levels which carries the momentum of the progressive overload with the program, especially if it is an RPE-based program. So I hope that clears things up with progressive overload. If you found this useful, please share this video with someone and let me know what your thoughts are in the comments below. And as always, click like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell, and I'll see you guys on the next one.